Hello and welcome to Radical Engagement here. And today we're going to do kind of a different thing, which is the anarchist engagement with and mild critique of left communism. We're going to read an article called Left Communism and Ideology by Oisín Mac Giollamóir. I hope I said that Irish Gaelic name right, but you know me and Irish Gaelic. I don't pronounce any European language pretty well, and including my own. So when it comes to Irish, I'm usually shut out of luck. So if anyone who actually speaks Gaelic can comment in the bottom, I would love to be corrected if I am wrong. All right. I know that Giollamóir usually gets anglicized as Gilmore, but I don't want to do that because I have a strange feeling that it's deliberately Galtech for a reason. All right. Anyway. Much ado about my pronunciations of things aside, let's get into this article. You can find it on the Anarchist Library. All right. Anarchism is today finally emerging out of its long-held position as the conscience of the workers' movement, as the eternal critic of Leninism and state-centered politics. Okay, cool. I mean, what are you criticizing it for is always the question. But nonetheless, it long took the side of the working class against the party, a position Lenin mocked when he wrote, "The mere presentation of the question of the dictatorship of the party of the dictatorship of the class, dictatorship party of the leaders, or dictatorship party of the masses, testifies to the most incredible and hopelessly muddled thinking. To contrast in dictatorship the dictatorship of the masses with the dictatorship of leaders is ridiculously absurd and stupid." Interestingly, this was not written by anarchists, but rather a position held by the Dutch-German Marxist tendency that was part of the Comintern. The tendency in others comprise what is known as left communism. There's a picture that we don't have. There has been a long, close relationship between anarchism and left communism. Long, close, and also antagonistic. As left communists took up many positions held by anarchists, the Dutch-German left developed positions that are indistinguishable from those that have been found within the anarchist movement. While anarchism influenced left communism in practice, left communism and Marxist tendencies closely related to it have been major theoretical influence on anarchism, in particular over the last 30 years. I would say once communization theory came out, it really accelerated. I'm literally writing an article about that on Bordigism and its weird relationship with communization theory. Through the likes of endnotes and Gilles Duvet. Nonetheless, we'll continue. Duvet is also Giollamóir's principal source, looking at his footnotes for a lot of these generalizations, so I might disagree with it sometimes. While left communist theories have indeed contributed greatly to the anarchist movement and to anarchist theory, a number of significant theoretical and tactical mistakes are evident in them. I mean, this is what I find interesting about this article, because I agree with some of the theoretical and tactical mistakes while not being an anarchist. So we'll get there. In this article, I will trace the development of these theories and give an introduction to the history of the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919 and to the Biennio Rosso of 1919 and 1920 in Italy, and I will also attempt to highlight the problems of these theories and insist on the need to develop an anarchist program for today based on the situation of our class today as opposed to ahistorical principles. That's interesting that an anarchist is critiquing a communist on ahistorical principles, but I actually do think some of the principles that Giollamóir is critiquing is legitimately ahistorical, or at least overheld to for too long. What is left communism? Left communism is extremely difficult to define. Yep. And when you add in that both social democrats and Marxist-Leninists like to call everyone who disagrees with them Trotskyites or ultra-leftist, you get into the problem pretty quickly. But neither the left opposition nor the workers' opposition within the Bolsheviks can be read as exactly the same thing as left communism. And while I am somewhat hesitant to extract communization out of the history of left communism, it does have so many theories that come from other places, analytical Marxism, anarchism, etc., that make it almost outside of the left communist orbit as well. So they develop out of it. There are various strands of left communism that emerge at different points in between 1917 and 1928. Oisín writes, the historic ultra-left refers to a number of such currents which emerged out of one of the most significant moments in the struggle against capitalism, the revolutionary wave that ended the First World War. Left communism is generally divided into two wings, the Dutch German left and the Italian left. Between the two groups, there is no love lost. Gilles Dubin, originally a Bordigist, writes, although both were attacked in Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder, Pannekoek regarded Bordiga as a weird brand of Leninist, and Bordiga viewed Pannekoek as a distasteful mixture of Marxism and anarcho-syndicalism. In fact, neither took any real interest in the other, and the German and Italian communists largely ignored each other. This is not true in the ICC, where a bunch of council communists, including Jean Appel himself, made forays to work with the Dement faction of the Italian communist left. That's part of the ICC's view of its historical origins. Whether or not that synthesis ever really holds up is highly debated. I know no Bordigist who thinks it's legitimist, whether they're a Bordigist or a Dementist. Or let's just say I know no Italian traditional left communist who thinks it's legitimate. But there are a bunch of things which show influence on Bordigism on the ICC. Now, I'm not here to get into weird sectariana of left communists. If you guys get bored by the sectariana of Trotskyists and Marxist-Leninists, the left communist sectariana is even more arcane. But it's just something to note so people can't say I'm not presenting things fairly. The Dutch, German, and Italian lefts were tendencies within the Comintern that ultimately broke with the Comintern and critiqued it from the left. As such, left communism, or ultra-leftism, is defined by its opposition to leftism. Oisín describes leftism thus. It can be thought of in terms of practice with the echo of some of the language of communism, but in fact represents a movement of the left wing of capital. A phrase often abused, is Varn talking, by post-left Marxists, etc., but it's still pretty much the historical position. I think that everybody now is in the left wing of capital because there's no Comintern or Cominform or anything like that to be the left of, but that would be me. All right. In other words, leftism describes those who are nominally communist but are in fact not. According to left communists, leftists are those who supported the Soviet Union in any manner, those who support or participate in trade unions. Bordigists don't, we're going to have to capture this. Bordigists don't actually have a problem with people who participate in trade unions. Those who participate in parliament, yep. Those who support national liberation movements in any manner. In theory, yes. In practice, no. And Bordigists also don't have a problem with national liberation. Dementists and councilists do. Whew, so many fine tooth to pass your hair through. All right. Are those who participate in any political coalition with non-communists. Left communists, on the other hand, are opposed to participating or supporting any of these types of struggle because they are not communist or because they are anti-working class. As such, left communists also define themselves negatively. Yep. They oppose themselves to those who do not hold real communist positions. They spend a lot of effort denouncing those who don't hold communist positions of absolute and practical opposition to USSR, to trade unions, to parliament, to national liberation movements, political coalitions, etc. And again, I would say Bordigist, at least the International Communist Party, don't have a problem with trade unions. The United Front from Below is tacitly accepted. And they don't always have a problem with national liberation movements, although they see them as bourgeois, but not necessarily bad. All right. In order to fully understand left communism, how and why it adopted these positions, we need to look at its development. In the revolutionary wave that followed the Russian Revolution, Germany and Italy were two places that were the closest to having successful communist revolutions, asterisks, in the developed core. They were also two places with the largest communist left tendencies. the Dutch-German left. The German Revolution of 1918 to 1919. In Germany in 1918, there was a wave of mass wildcat strikes that ultimately led to a revolution breaking out in November, which ended World War I. Sailors, mutinies, and workers' councils were set up across the country. The SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, a few years later was universally considered one of the world's... A few years earlier, not later, it's a very big difference, was universally considered one of the world's greatest revolutionary Marxist parties and the leader of the Second International, but had in 1914 supported the drive to war. It took part in the revolution despite opposing it. Therefore, it managed to get a majority vote in the First National Congress of the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils in favor of elections to a constituent assembly and for dissolving the councils in favor of that parliament. But at the same time, the trade unions worked hand in hand with management to get revolutionary workers dismissed and to destroy the independent council activity in such factories. Councils against parliament and trade unions became the watchword of the revolutionaries. And that is from Aufhebung. At the turn of the year, the KPD, the German Communist Party, was founded. On the basis of their recent experience, the majority of the workers of the KPD developed a revolutionary critique of parliamentary activism and raised the slogan, all power to the workers' councils, or all power to the Soviets. However, the leaders of the party, including Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, upheld this on the basis that it was anarchist. The anti-parliamentarian majority was also opposed to trade unions on the basis of their experience of the German Social Democratic trade unions opposing revolutionary movement and actively trying to crush it. On this point, the leadership was opposed to the majority. Ultimately, in October 1919, this disagreement led to the leadership expelling over half of the party's membership. These expelled members went on to form the left communist KPD, German Communist Workers' Party. Communist Arbeiterisch Partei Deutschland. The KPD left the Comintern after the Third Congress in 1921 for reasons that the anarchists would be very sympathetic towards. They believed that the revolution would not be made by a political party, but could only be made by the working class itself, organized in its own autonomous organizations. The organizations that the KPD worked within was the AAUD, the General Workers' Union of Germany. At its height, it was an organization of around 300,000 workers. The AAUD emerged during the German Revolution in 1919. Jan Appel describes its formation. Quote, "We arrived at the conclusion that the unions were quite useless for the purpose of revolutionary struggle, and at the conference of the revolutionary shop stewards, the formation of a revolutionary factory organization as the basis for the workers' councils was decided upon." So the KPD primarily worked with communist unions and not other trade and guild unions. And also was generally pretty wary of syndicalists. So we'll come back to that. Council communism. Based on their experience, the left communists in Germany critiqued Lenin's argument and left-wing communism and infantile disorder, firstly on the basis that although the Bolshevik model of organization made sense in Russia. Now, this is interesting that Pannekoek and Otto Rühle, etc., actually thought that the Bolshevik model of organization was good in Russia. Later on, they would accuse Lenin of being bourgeois-minded. So that distinction is kind of interesting. At least that's from the Dutch area. As well as Germany was more industrial developed with different forms of proletarian struggle were needed. Yeah, the relevance of the peasant and worker dictatorship was not there for Germany. They argued that through self-organization in factories, workers laid the basis for setting up workers' councils, which was, of course, the way the Soviets were originally aligned. After all, the Soviet is a workers' council. They argued that this form of organization was a single form of organization suitable for revolutionary struggle for the working class, and as such, they argued against activity in trade unions, parliament, and the primacy of party. The KPD aimed to represent and lead the working class, but not to represent and lead the working class, but rather to enlighten it. It was a vanguard movement in the earlier sense of the notion that they didn't want to be leaders, but educators. A similar project to the idea bounced by by the Dilotruda group. Quote, all assistance afforded to the masses in the realm of ideas must be consonant with the ideology of anarchism, otherwise it will not be anarchist assistance. Ideologically, assist simply means influence from the point of from the idea's point of view, direct from the idea's point of view, a leadership of ideas. However, some left communists, such as Otto Rühle, felt that even this was too much. They left the KAPD and the AAUD, and objecting to the involvement of the KAPD in the AAUD, set up the AAUDE, the General Workers' Union of Germany Unity Organization. We already see how this continues. The majority of those who claim a legacy from the Dutch-German left, who call themselves council communists, take the position of Rühle and the AAUDE. For that reason, they refuse to form political organizations. Dubin explains this theory thus, quote, any revolutionary organization coexisting with organs created by the workers themselves and trying to elaborate a coherent theory and political line must, in the end, attempt to lead the workers. Therefore, revolutionaries do not organize themselves outside of organs spontaneously created by workers. They merely exchange and circulate information and establish contact with other revolutionaries. They will never try to defend a general theory or strategy. End quote by Dubin. Pannekoek wrote in 1936, the old labor movement moved in organized parties. The belief in parties was the main reason for the impotence of the working class. Therefore, we avoid forming a new party. Not because we are too few, but because the party is an organization that aims to lead and control the working class. In opposition to this, we maintain that the working class can rise to victory only when it independently attacks its problems and decides its own fate. The workers should not blindly accept the slogans of others, nor of our own group, but must think, act, and decide for themselves. This conception is in sharp contradiction to the tradition of the party as most important means of educating the proletariat. Therefore, many, though repudiating the socialist and communist parties, resist and oppose us. This is partly due to their traditional concept. After viewing class struggle as a struggle of parties, it becomes difficult to consider that it is purely a struggle of the working class as a class struggle. End long quote from Anton Pannekoek. While the idea of the working class struggle being purely a struggle of the working class is essential, it often hides major theoretical and practical problems. Yeah, it does. First, what does it mean to take the side of the class as opposed to the party? What does the working class without a party look like? What does it mean to reject parties? If we take Dubin's understanding that this rejection of partyism is a rejection of any attempt to elaborate a coherent theory and political line, then we face a problem. If any attempt to elaborate a coherent theory and political line is forbidden, then how can a class develop a coherent theory and political line to guide itself through a revolution and to victory? How can a class think strategically if strategic thinking is banned, lest it be oppressive or vanguardist? Yeah, I mean, that actually seems even more than most anarchists would be okay with, as Giollamóir here is making clear. In a revolution, there will be a number of conflicting theories and political lines put forward. Absolutely. This is why I'm talking. You absolutely have a non-homogeneous voice emerging of the working class in revolutionary conditions. To aim otherwise is highly naive, and if those of us who believe in the emancipation of working classes must be achieved by the working classes themselves don't enter a revolution prepared with a program explaining how this can be achieved, the revolution will, like all prior workers' revolutions, fail. And it was this precisely the lack of program that spelled failure for the anti-position in Russia and Spain. Ouch, yeah. The Dilotruda group explains the failure in Russia. Quote, we have fallen into the habit of ascribing the anarchist movement's failure in Russia in 1917 and 1990 to the Bolshevik Party's statist repression, which is a serious error. Bolshevik repression hampered the anarchist movement's spread during the revolution, but it was only one obstacle. Rather, it was the anarchist movement's own internal ineffectuality which led to the chief causes of failure, and ineffectuality emanating from the vagueness and indecisiveness that characterized its main policy statement on organizations and tactics. Anarchism had no firm, hard and fast opinion regarding the main problem facing social revolution, an opinion that needed to satisfy the masses who were carrying out the revolution. Anarchists were calling for the seizure of the factories, but held no well-defined homogeneous notion of what the new production and the structures. Anarchists championed the communist device from each according to their abilities to each according to their need, but they never bothered to apply this precept to the real world. Ellipses. Anarchists talk a lot about talked a lot about revolutionary activity of the workers themselves, but they weren't able to direct the masses, even roughly, towards forms of which such activity might assume. They incited the masses to shrug off the yoke of authority, but they did not indicate how the gains of revolution would be consolidated and defended. They had no idea, no clear-cut opinion and specific action policies in regards to lots of other problems, which is what alienated them from the activities of the masses and condemned them to social and historical impotence. Upon 20 years of experience, revolutionary activity, 20 years of efforts in anarchist ranks, and the efforts that met with nothing but failures by the anarchism as an organizing movement, all this has convinced us that the necessity of a new comprehensive anarchist party organization rooted in one homogeneous theory, policy, and tactic. Which sounds like anarchist Bordigism. We'll get back to that. That's kind of an interesting development. Haven't really dug into that. While the German left neglected the need for a program and denounced all parties as oppressive or at least vanguardist, the Italian left took a completely different angle. Yes, it did. The Italian left. Bordiga and the Biennio Rosso. The Italian left was in the early stages under political tutelage of one man, Amedeo Bordiga. After joining the Youth Federation of the PSI, the Italian Socialist Party, Bordiga quickly rose to prominence by aligning himself with the golden boy of that federation and head of the Maximalist faction, Benito Mussolini. The vitality of the Youth Federation was the main reason for the PSI growing from 20,459 in 1912 to 47,724 in 1914. That's, doubling in 2 years in a time before mass communication. Ultimately, Bordiga broke with Mussolini in the question of supporting World War I. Bordiga had asserted that supporting wars was a betrayal of Marxist principles. He was an insurgent on points of principle. He was intransigent on points of principle. Yeah, he was. And insurgent, really. And on the question of communist program, and defended a rigid textual analysis of Marx. And I think Bordiga's a pretty good reader of Marx, despite some very big disagreements I have with him. He wrote, "By Marxism, we understand a method laid down by Marx and many others, but culminates in the diagnosis of the daily crisis struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, constructing a prophecy and a program which should brew the proletarian triumph. Bordiga's orthodoxy set him firmly against the revisionism of the leaders of the PSI. He had held that a fresh start, bringing about a renewal of principle, was needed within the party. By 1918, the total of World War I for Italy was over 680,000 dead and over 1 million wounded. The working class flocked to the PSI as it became more and more radicalized. And by 1919, the PSI, which just 7 years previously had 20,459 members, had grown to over 200,000. And in 1919, as workers returned home from war, they found themselves caught in a spiral of inflation and mass employment as the Italian economy struggled to adjust to the influx of returning workers. By 1918, World War I for Italy was over 680,000 dead and over 1 million wounded. The working class flocked to the PSI as it became more and more radicalized. By 1919, the PSI, which was just 7 years previously, had 20,559 members, had grown over 200,000. In 1919, workers returned home from the war. They found themselves caught up in a spiral of inflation and mass unemployment as the Italian economy struggled to adjust to the influx of returning workers. Starting in April 1919 and continuing through August, there was widespread popular rioting. The government tried desperately to put down these insurgent workers, killing workers in Milan, Florence, Enola, Taranto, Genoa, and other cities. In Turin, at the end of August, new shop stewards organizations were formed in the Fiat plant. These shop stewards organizations, in turn, formed a factory council. This new type of grassroots workers' organization quickly spread to the workplaces of Turin. Though the use of these factory councils on October 31st, these workers adopted a program to restructure the unions, turning them into organizations of workers' democracy. This program stated its purpose was to, quote, set and train a practical realization of communist society. Very syndicalist, but nonetheless. At a meeting on December 14-15th, the proponents of the new factory council system were able to win endorsement of the entire Turin labor movement. By 1920, over 50,000 workers were in Turin, area alone were organized in the new council system. At a conference, the Anarcho-Socialist Union, the USI, in the Anarcho-Socialist Union, the USI, in early 1920, the USI placed itself firmly on the side of these new organizations and agitated strongly for the development outside Turin. This saw the USI grow from 300,000 in 1919 to 800,000 at the peak of the movement in September of 1920. 8 times the size of the DSA. For the Americans who really care about such things. In response to these movements, at their Bologna Congress in 1919, the PSI adopted a revolutionary program. The following month, in the back of this program, they received 1,800,000 votes, making them the biggest party in the Italian parliament. However, despite this program being adopted, the PSI was divided into the parliamentary party, such as Filippo Toranti, fully opposing the program and actively trying to sabotage it. Toranti stated that the PSI must not excite the blind passions and fatal illusions of the crowd. He claimed that Parliament was the workers' councils as to the city was to the barbaric horde. These sentiments resulted in Bordiga pushing hard for Toranti's expulsion from the party. Antonio Gramsci attacked Toranti, accusing him of having mocking skepticism of senility. Even Toranti, the party's centrist leader, at this point was attacking Toranti, accusing his politics of being based on pure illusion. He wrote that, quote, "It's painful that a socialist deputy, one of those in whom the masses most believe, should dedicate most obstinately and energy fighting Bolshevism than opposing all the attempts at the mystification of socialism that are coming from the bourgeoisie." However, this was nothing but words from the party leader, and Bordiga attacked Toranti for not expelling Toranti. Bordiga also called for an end to the parliamentary party's power, this run the Toranti's influence, and took up an abstentionist position. He wrote, "Elections, while the bourgeoisie have power and wealth in their hands, will never do anything but confirm their privilege." A classical Marxist sentiment, actually. But notice while the bourgeoisie have power and wealth in their hands, which I think is a different thing than where Bordiga eventually ends up, which is condemnations of all of democracy as being bourgeois. The first 4 months of 1920 saw levels of high struggle in Italy, reaching their peak in April. At the Fiat plant in Turin, a General Assembly called for a sit-in strike to protest the dismemberment of several shop stewards. In response, the employees locked out 80,000 workers. In the Piedmont, the region of Italy in which Turin is the capital, a general strike ensued involving 500,000 workers. There were also strikes around Genoa, led by the USI, and in Milan, workers' councils like those in Turin emerged from the influence of the USI. In the rest of the country, unions under anarcho-syndicalist influence, such as the independent railway unions and the Maritime Workers Union, came out in support. However, despite the appeals from Turin movement and the PSI led trade unions, the CGL, the General Confederations of Labor, for a strike to extend across Italy, the PSI and the CGL failed to act. Gramsci, who was working hard through his journal L'Ora di Nouveau to support the council movement, commented bitterly on the PSI's leadership. They went on chattering about the Soviets and councils in the Piedmont and Turin. 500,000 workers starved to defend the councils that had already existed. Ultimately, the strike was defeated. Gramsci wrote, "The Turinese working class had been defeated. Among the conditions determining their defeat was the limited-mindedness of the leaders of the Italian working class movement. Among the second-level conditions determining the defeat is the lack of revolutionary cohesion of the entire Italian proletariat, which cannot be brought forth, a trade union hierarchy which reflects its interest in its revolutionary spirit." Gramsci blamed the failure of the movement simultaneously on the ineffectuality of the leadership of the PSI and the CGL, and on the inability of the movement to throw itself a new leadership, organic intellectuals who would act as a new hierarchy. While Gramsci felt the councils were institutions through which the dictatorship of the proletariat could be exercised, Toranti claimed that the councils could not be used to initiate revolutionary action. He argued that the dictatorship of the proletariat is a conscious dictatorship of the Socialist Party. We can already see Toranti and Bordiga picking that up. On this, Bordiga was firmly on the side of Toranti. He argued that the excessive influence in the economic sphere and on the simulation of party consciousness, Gramsci had forgotten the state would not simply disappear in a revolution. And of course, on this, Bordiga was right. Anarchists learned so tragically in Spain. He wrote, "It is rumored that factory councils, when they were in existence, functioned by taking over the management of the workshops and carrying on the work. We would like the working masses not to get hold of the idea that all they need to do is take over the factories and get rid of the capitalists and set up councils. This would indeed be a dangerous illusion. The factory will be conquered by the working class and not only by the workforce employed in it. which I think is actually a good point, in which would be too weak and non-communist after the working class as a whole has seized power, unless it has done so, like the royal guards, military police, etc. In other words, the mechanisms of force and oppression that the bourgeoisie has at its disposal, its political power apparatus, will see all these illusions soon dispelled. On this, Bordiga raises two significant issues. Firstly, as noted, until the revolutionary class has seized power, thereby removing all power from the hands of the bourgeoisie will use its state to crush the working class, even if it has to wait almost a full year to do this, as happened in Spain. Secondly, communism is not simply the seizing of control of the factory or the capitalist enterprise by those who work in it. Communism is not transferring the workplaces into democratic cooperatives, as Bordiga notes. Revolution is not a question of the form of organization. Communism is when wage labor and the enterprise is abolished and all capital is captured by the working class as a whole and put to work for the benefit of the human community, not for profit. As Bordiga writes elsewhere, socialism resides entirely in the revolutionary negation of the capitalist enterprise, not granting the enterprise to the factory workers. I pretty much agree with that. It is precisely this insistence on the importance of the content of communism, the abolition of wage labor, and the market economy with its incumbent division of labor that makes Bordiga of any interest. A major problem, however, is Bordiga's understanding of how the state is destroyed and how the content of communism is realized. He writes, only a communist party should and would be able to carry such an undertaking. Since 1915, Bordiga had been insisting on the need for a theoretically pure communist party, and after the second revolutionary upsurge in September 1920, he got his way. Lynn Williams describes this revolutionary upsurge. Between the 1st and 4th of September, metal workers occupied factories throughout the Italian peninsula. The occupations rolled forth not only in a slow industrial heartland around Milan, Turin, and Genoa, but in Rome, Florence, Naples, and Palermo. In the forest of red and black flags and the fanfare of workers' bands, within 3 days, 400,000 workers were in occupation. At this moment, movement spread to other sectors. The total rose to 500,000. Everyone was stunned by the response. Gramsci once again threw himself into the struggle, while Taranti and the reformists went so far as to advise the government to use force against the occupiers of the factories. Ultimately, due to the complete betrayal of the PSI and the CGL of the working class, the revolutionary opportunity was missed. And after this, Bordiga took his chance to push for a split, and by threatening to go it alone, brought Gramsci with him. At the Livorno Congress of the PSI in January 1921, the party split. 14,965 voted for Taranti and the reformists, 58,783 voted for the communists, Bordiga and Gramsci, and Togliatti, for a split, and 98,000 voted for Taranti and unity. So on the 21st of January, the PCI, the Italian Communist Party, was founded. Bordiga and the party. The party failed to take off. In fact, many of its 58,783 that voted for it in the PSI left. Within a year, the membership had fallen to 24,638. Oof. A major reason for this was that the Biennio Rosso of 1919-1920 had ended. A revolutionary opportunity was missed, and many simply ceased to be engaged in revolutionary class struggle. Bizarrely, this did not bother Bordiga or the PCI. Bordiga wrote, the entire center of the doctrine is not a concept of class struggle, but that of the development into the dictatorship of proletariat, exercised by the latter alone in a single organization, excluding other classes, with energetic, coercive force, thus under the guidance of the party. In other words, for Bordiga, the issue was not class struggle, but the purity of communist program and the ability of the party to seize control of the state. Lauren Goldner notes, for Bordiga, the program was everything. A gate receipt notion of members was nothing. The notion of the party in the period of ebb was to preserve the program and to carry out agitational and propaganda work possible until the next turn of the tide, not to dilute it with chasing ephemeral popularity. Bordiga wrote, when from the invariant doctrine we draw the conclusion that the revolutionary victory of the working class can only be achieved with the party and its dictatorship. Notice it's dictatorship of the party. Bordiga was fully comfortable with the party being a small and isolated away from class struggle. What was important for him that it was fully communist and fitted the communist program for those who had diluted or perverted from its course, from its realization. Jacques Camus explained this position in early 1961 in an article published in Bordiga's journal, Il Programma Comunista. And Camus and Dubin tend to be like why the Americans got their Bordigist understanding from the French and not the Italians. Anyway, the proletariat abandons its program in the period of defeat. This program is only defended by a weak minority. The only program party always reinforced the struggle. The struggle from 1926 to today proves that fully. In all the parties of the Italian left, you find similar insistences on their role of the defenders of the invariant communist program of the proletariat. While they differ over exactly what the invariant doctrine program of the communism is, the insistence on the real existence of the invariant doctrine program runs through all of them. And there are many. There's two, but there's the Internationalist Communist Party, the International Communist Party, the ICT, etc., etc., etc. However, as has been pointed out by many, communism is not fundamentally about the adoption of a set of principles, lines, and positions. As Marx writes, communism is not for us a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The conditions of this movement result from premises now in existence. Even Engels writes, communism is not a doctrine but a movement. It proceeds not from principles but from facts. The communists do not base themselves on this or that philosophy at this point of departure, but on the whole course of previous history and specifically its actual results in civilized countries at the present time. Communism, insofar that it has a theory, is the theoretical expression of the position of the proletariat in class struggle and the theoretical summation of the conditions of liberation of the proletariat. Of course, this simple fact that the anarchism communism is not an ideal to be realized or a set of principles, but a real movement is so obvious that it may seem strange to emphasize it. Anarchists have long realized this, as Dilo Truda group writes. Anarchism is no beautiful fantasy, no abstract notion of philosophy, but a social movement of the working masses. But what is the real movement which abolishes the present state of things? The answer, of course, is class struggle. Conclusion. While the Italian left insisted on a communist program that would be to be realized by the party of the working class, the Dutch German left insisted on the class did not need a party or a program, and they would be obstacles to the working class realizing communism. This fundamental divide in left communist praxis is always fascinated me. Why they still got linked together and why there have been attempts to bridge them. I mean, both the ICT and the communization, which the ICT, of course, criticizes, are attempts to bridge this gap. And they're very diametrically opposed gaps. In the Italian left, we find the communist program separated from the working class. In the German left, we find the exact same. The difference is the Italian left insists on defending the communist program from impurity, while the German left insists on defending the working class. The solution is surely to unite the two, the working class and communism, and say the working class is a communist subject. This position is adopted by most left communists today. However, the first problem with this position is that the working class is not a communist subject. Communism is not always already realized in the working class. Yes, I actually find it really frustrating that we assume that it is and kind of borderline dishonest. We remember that the working class is not communist, rather capable of producing communism. The working class does not interest us because of what it is. It interests us because of what it can do, and obviously because we are part of it, or at least some of us are a part of it. Secondly, as Guy Bedore noted, history has no object distinct from what takes place within it. Communism arises today as a possibility, not as a future to be realized. It is not a real future towards which we work. Yeah, I agree with that too. The communist project is not teleological. In simple terms, the idea that history develops towards a fixed end, communism, is completely wrong. Yeah, we have no evidence for it. It's been the major intellectual crisis of Marxist history and one that I'm no longer willing to defend. Communism is something that emerges and develops out of struggle today. Communism is not something that we can be discovered or defended, rather that it emerges from class struggle. Therefore, all we can do is engage in class struggle and try to push things forward, to try to turn the class that has the potential to create communism into a class that does create communism. The job of communists is not to defend interest, the communist program of the working class, from corruption, as so many left communists seem to believe. Firstly, because there is no communist program to be defended. Secondly, I'm always vague about which program they think is the invariant one. I mean, I know they lay it out in the Leon theses, which is why we're covering it, but it's always seemed a little bit weak to me. Secondly, because the working class does not have any interest outside of struggle, i.e. it is not the permanent interest which can be defended. A job of communists is to get stuck down into the grim and grit of real struggle as it is happening, with all the contradictions that are involved in it. Absolutely, Oisín. We must be active in the class struggle, pushing hard for anarchist communism. I mean, I'm not so big on the anarchist part, but whatever. I'm not also wanting to kick all the anarchists out or pretend they're all petit bourgeois sympathizers or whatever either. Whatever class antagonism emerges as revolutionaries, we must be there in the advancement of the revolutionary cause. When Marx writes that communism is a real movement, not an ideal, and when Engels writes that communism is an expression of the proletariat and struggle and not a doctrine, when the Dilo Truda group writes that anarchism is a social movement, not a philosophy, they mean it. We are interested in class struggle as it is, not as it is idealized. Bingo. In our analysis of history, we look for class struggle, but we must not look for an independent trend, independent, separate, or autonomous forms of capital and capitalist ideologies. It is always as a trend within capitalism, the previous form of class-based society, that class struggle exists and interests us. Class struggle arises from the contradictions of capital. If capital effects can be found everywhere, likewise, its contradictions can be found everywhere. Bingo. Dead on, Oisín. Are the put otherwise, the revolutionary subject emerges due to the contradiction between the people's need and desires and limits put on it under capitalism. Our politics must begin at this point, at the contradiction in which our daily lives between our needs, our desires, and what we see as possible, the constraints capital puts on us by operating according to an alien logic that forces us to abandon our needs, our desires, and our dreams and work according to its dictate. Our revolutionary politics must always begin with the working class resistance to this experience. It must be an intervention not to assert or defend communism or the working class as an ideal against forms of impurities, but rather a search for the quickest, speediest, and most painless route from here to where we want to go. And where we want to go, according to communists, both anarchist and otherwise, is a classless society. While I'm not an anarchist, this was a good breakdown of some of the problems I see in both movements. After all, you cannot truly be outside of capital if everything is within a capitalist framework. So to call the left of capital, but exclude yourself from that, is to posit that you somehow exist in a framework outside of it. You don't. There's no invariant communist program. Nothing in Marx indicates invariance. In fact, their own program evolves and changes throughout the history of the development of Marxism and communism. And on that note, we'll end today with me praising an article for once. Take care.